For some, James Connolly is a 1916 patriot, a soldier, a union leader, and a great political thinker. For others, he's an idealist, a lefty, and a socialist dreamer. But James Connolly is my hero because he was a real human being with passion, dreams, and flaws who dedicated his life to working class men and women, not only in Ireland, but around the world. And ultimately, they were his words which inspired the 1916 proclamation, which defines our innate sense of decency and fairness as a society. That is the greatness of the man.
And it's especially ironic when you consider the sort of poverty James was born into in Edinburgh in 1868. He was the youngest son of penniless Irish emigrants who ended up in the Cowgate district of the city, a slum area known locally as Little Ireland, where tens of thousands of people lived in horrible, squalid conditions.
The first-hand experience of poverty was to cast a long shadow over James Connolly's entire life. His parents, John Connolly, Mary McGinn, famine emigrants, fled Monaghan, came here to Edinburgh. His father became a manure carter, which basically means a shoveler of animal and human excrement. And he rose in his life to finally become the supervisor of this public toilet here in Haymarket in Edinburgh.
In Cowgate, overcrowding, poverty, disease, drunkenness and unemployment were rife. The immigrants were mostly unskilled labourers, work was difficult to find, and the newly arrived Irish were seen as the lowest of the low. And if that wasn't tough enough, Connolly had chronically poor eyesight, had a bit of a stammer, suffered from rickets as a child, and at an early age lost his mother to bronchitis. He had to take whatever life threw at him.
Just try to imagine the poverty of the life of James Connolly here in Cowgate. 9 years of age, he'd left school, was working in a printer's, a baker's. One contemporary described this place, the narrow streets, the dingy tenements, the foul smell, the heavy, murky smoke, the toppling chimneys and the battered and patched roofs of Cowgate. And then to get out of this abject poverty, James Connolly did what so many did at that time. They'd no choice, and that was he joined the British Army.
James Connolly's very first visit to Ireland was when he was posted there as a British soldier. James and Lily married in Scotland in 1889, and having discharged himself from the army, the 21-year-old Connolly went looking for work to support Lily and their young family. He tried various jobs, including shoveling manure and human excrement, like his father before him. He even had his own cobbler's business, but throughout this period of his life, he found it hard to keep any of these jobs, and even harder to make ends meet.
When Connolly closed up his cobbler's business here in Edinburgh, he said, "I'm going to buy myself a mirror so I can watch myself starve." And now we come to a major turning point in the life of James Connolly and his family. Totally destitute, they look at their options. They even consider emigrating to Chile, where the government are offering land opportunities for emigrants, but Lily is totally against it. There's only one other option. Through his Scottish socialist friends, he's offered a job as organiser of a socialist club. The princely sum of £1 a week. Where? Dublin.
In 1896, James and Lily returned to the city where they had first met. James was now a 28-year-old father of 3 with a 4th child on the way. He and Lily set up home in tenements just like this one, first in Charlemont Street and then Pimlico. But the job that brought James back to the city only provided a tiny, irregular wage. Life was no better than it was in Edinburgh.
At the beginning of the 20th century in Dublin, 1 in 3 people were living in tenements. Places like this teeming with children, teeming with noise, the doors left open all the time. Water sanitation was outside the room, cooking was on the open fire. Mortality rates in these tenements for babies was the highest in all of Europe. The people who lived here would have been manual labourers, eking a living, going from job to job. There was no stability. They'd walk down the docks, they'd work carting or carrying, up at the fish market, the fruit market, whatever work was to be come by. There was no social welfare, there was no unemployment benefit, there was no safety net, there was no help apart from the church or St. Vincent de Paul for people who were in dire, dire poverty. James was not only trying to make a living outside for his family and bringing home whatever he could, which is very, very, very meagre. He was also trying to write here. He was trying to organise and try to spread an energy among people to try and better themselves.
At this stage of his life, Connolly was no great political hero standing up for the downtrodden. He was the downtrodden. There was no money coming in. The family were constantly pawning possessions to stay afloat or to buy work clothes for James to get a day's labour. Once he even went to work with lily slippers tied to his feet with laces. Connolly's socialist principles and public organising were not helping him to get any work, so he had a lot of time on his hands. As an avid reader and self-taught scholar, he ended up spending a lot of that spare time reading, thinking and staying warm here in the National Library.
In here are the origins of Connolly's unique thinking. When he arrived in Ireland, he was a committed socialist, but in here he learned that republicanism and socialism were inextricably linked, and the only way to save the working man from his poverty and his slavery to the bosses was a workers' republic.
Connolly read widely ancient Irish history, sociology and the development of human behaviour, just to see if he could trace the natural origins of socialism, to show that it wasn't just some intellectual invention. He could see socialist structures in the way the old Irish clan system worked across thousands of years of Irish history. He saw the ancient clan attitudes to land ownership as a kind of Celtic communism, and he believed this would make socialism connect to the ordinary Irish man or woman, to make it resonate with being Irish.
Connolly hibernicized socialism. In international terms, that's what he's still highly regarded for to this day, taking a pure global theory and applying it to the needs, the realities and beliefs of people in one country, making it relevant to the working man.
In 1897, he and Maud Gonne organised very public and provocative protests around the Jubilee celebrations for Queen Victoria. Not surprisingly, standing up for a workers' republic against the oppression of Victoria's empire did not go down too well.
One of the stunts involved Connolly bringing a black coffin down Sackville Street with the words British Empire emblazoned on it. Faced with the police at the bridge here, he dumped the coffin into the Liffey. And as a result, he spent his first night at Her Majesty's pleasure. He was 29 years of age. The following morning, Maud Gonne brought him breakfast, bailed him out. The revolution in his head had just begun.
Connolly immediately joined Jim Larkin in the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, and they began to coordinate strikes in industrial hubs like Belfast, Dublin and Wexford. There was a feeling in Ireland that a fuse was being lit beneath a powder keg.
James Connolly wasn't just a visionary, he was also very, very hard-headed. For him, socialism wasn't just about the head, it was about the stomach, it was about people coming together for basic rights and acting together for basic rights. So Connolly moved from thinking to doing, from speaking out to standing up. The weaker the victim, the greater his indignation. And at the core of each issue was dignity, self-respect, holding your head up high. And with Larkin and Connolly together standing up for the workers, this was bound to irritate the very people who took advantage of cheap, unskilled labour.
Publisher and tramway owner William Martin Murphy led Dublin's employers against workers' demands and unionisation. Murphy was also a supporter of Home Rule, whereas Connolly had always believed that Home Rule just meant replacing greedy British bosses with greedy Irish ones. Their war of words and ideas finally came to a head in 1913 with the lockout. 20,000 workers and 300 employers squared up for one of the most severe and significant industrial disputes in modern history. Neither side had any intention of compromising.
The employers brought in scab labour from the countryside and from across the water. The Catholic Church objected to the children of strikers being taken to England to be looked after because of the unholy influence it might have on them. But at one stage, James got a group of hungry children and marched them up to Archbishop's Palace and suggested that he show as much interest in their stomachs as he had in their souls.
For 7 months, the lockout affected tens of thousands of Dublin's workers and their families. The strikers used mass pickets and intimidation against strike breakers, while the police baton-charged rallies, even killing 2 workers on what is now O'Connell Street during one notorious protest, the first Bloody Sunday. In response, Larkin and Connolly formed a workers' militia, the Irish Citizen Army, a force to protect workers and their demonstrations. The lockout was the embodiment of everything Connolly has spent his life standing up for, fighting for the decency of the working class. But would it bring about the workers' republic he dreamed of? By early 1914, the locked-out workers and their families were on the brink of starvation, and the writing was on the wall for Connolly and the union leadership.
Connolly and Larkin could not get the support of the British TUC or offers of sympathetic strikes in England. Workers returned to work and signed agreements not to be part of a union. The workers' revolution had failed.
It was a terrible blow to the workers and to Connolly, but the knock-on effects were even more telling. Big Jim Larkin left Ireland for America, and in a despairing echo of Connolly's own young life, many of the striking lockout workers now chose a wage and enlisted to fight for king and country with the outbreak of World War I.
Although Connolly had been in exactly the same situation as a 14-year-old in Edinburgh, as indeed members of my own family were here, he was heartbroken that the working people of Europe were enlisting to fight each other. He said, "I would rather an Irishman die fighting for class freedom in his own country than in a foreign country fighting for profiteers."
Connolly was straining at the leash for revolution. In January 1916, he was kidnapped by those in the secret Irish Republican Brotherhood who wanted to talk him out of launching any attack too soon. They wanted him to wait. They all eventually agreed on an Easter rebellion.
On the Monday morning, Pearse may have been political leader, but James Connolly was the military leader, the commander of all the armed forces. And he told his men, there's no citizen army now or volunteer force. We're all part of the Irish Republican Army. And as he got to the steps of Liberty Hall, he turned to his good friend William O'Brien and said, "We are all going to be slaughtered." James Connolly was the greatest Irish person who ever lived. Above all, he believed in treating the ordinary worker not as a commodity for sale, but with respect and dignity. And others may label him a communist or a socialist dreamer, but above all, he believed in one big vision, a better society for all, throughout his entire unselfish life. And if that is not greatness, I don't know what is.